Well, there's a budget tomorrow, maybe the last budget before the general election. And with me now in GB News Studio, Westminster, is Suella Braverman, the former Home Secretary. Suella, welcome to the studio.
Hello.
What taxes would you cut?
Well, I should say, first of all, I think we need to take a pragmatic and responsible approach to tax cuts. We need to put the British taxpayer first because we're living through a 70-year high when it comes to the tax burden. But we also need to be able to afford those tax cuts. And we can't make uncosted promises. Labour makes uncosted and unfunded promises, and we are not them. We take a prudent approach.
The Tories did once, of course, under Liz Truss.
Well, I want to ensure that our public services are safeguarded because at the end of the day, I want tax cuts, but no tax cut, however radical, will make up for the experience of people not being able to see a GP or a dentist or getting a police officer to attend a burglary. So we do need to take a responsible approach to our public service delivery and value for money for the British taxpayer. So that's the overall approach I would take.
Yes, that's the mood music. But what taxes would you cut if you could? We hear maybe 2%, 2p off national insurance, for example. Is that enough?
Well, I think personal taxes are a good place to start. Given that 70-year high, and it sends a message to the British taxpayer that we're on your side and your work will pay. My preference would be 2p off the basic rate of income tax. And, Rishi Sunak himself promised to take a penny off the basic rate. I would go further with 2p because I think that would really send the message that people will be able to keep more of what they earn. I think it also needs to be accompanied with a rising of the personal allowance and tax income thresholds, because we've got the invidious situation now that our tax system actually disincentivizes work. It disincentivizes people from taking that promotion or working extra hours. And we've got millions of low and middle earners, particularly middle earners, nurses and teachers who are being dragged into paying higher levels of tax in a way that was never intended.
Because they're frozen because of inflation.
Because in 2021, the then Chancellor Rishi Sunak froze the thresholds, and so they haven't risen in line with inflation. And that fiscal drag is really quite punitive and a real disincentive on productivity. So if we really want to send the message that work pays, that people should work harder and they should work longer, and actually they're not working for the taxman, they're working for themselves and their families, and that's what we stand for as Conservatives. A bold but affordable measure would be to raise the personal allowance and also the income tax brackets.
Yes, and cut tax by income tax by 2p.
Yes.
How would you pay for that? There's speculation about the non-dom status to be abolished or scaled back, or some measures about second holiday homes, and the fuel duty, of course, that 5p increase won't go ahead. How would you pay for it?
Well, I think there are three ways. First of all, we know that the Treasury has about £15 billion of fiscal headroom, thanks to lower than expected borrowing costs and a record surplus. And actually, we should remember the economic climate is a lot better than it was 12 months ago. Inflation has fallen, the economy is growing, and debt's falling. So I think that, many of these tax cuts will be affordable with that fiscal headroom and that leeway that the Chancellor has. I think that money should go to paying those tax cuts. I think, secondly, we also need to raise revenue in more creative ways. I'm very interested, and it's something I did as Home Secretary, in raising taxes and charges on businesses that employ foreign workers. So we have already an immigration health surcharge and an immigration skills charge. I think we need to increase those charges. That would not only raise revenue, estimated to be up to £8 billion, but it will also have a corollary benefit, I think, of lowering net migration. We know the British people have voted time and time again to lower overall numbers, and we have unprecedented numbers of foreign workers coming in. And then lastly, I think we've got to take a long, rigorous look at whether we're getting value for money for the British taxpayer in Whitehall. And I support Jeremy Hunt's war on immoral Whitehall waste, as he put it.
So what's an example of that?
Well, I mean, listen, I worked with Jeremy quite closely as Home Secretary to trim the fat on Home Office spending. It's a department which has over 40,000 civil servants. I think that's far too much for the work being done by that department. But more specifically, there are things like £12 billion of taxpayer money goes towards the railways every year. Is that value for money when many parts of the country see trains which are running nearly empty and sometimes not at all because the rail companies have fallen out with their employees? Or £20 billion of taxpayers' money going towards carbon capture and storage? I think that should be largely funded by private investment with limited taxpayer funding. I don't think that's value for money. And there are countless examples of where we're not getting value for money, and a rigorous assessment would really save billions tens of billions of pounds, which can pay for tax cuts.
Lots of ideas there. One is fascinating here. You raise taxes on companies that employ immigrant labour to try and deal with net migration. Was that an issue you raised when you were Home Secretary?
Well, as Home Secretary, I did succeed in the conversation and secured agreement with the Chancellor on raising visa fees. And so we did see about a 10% hike in visa fees. But if you look at it, it's a very inelastic demand. Numbers of visas have gone up year on year. They've reached unprecedented levels, 700,000 net migration number last year. I think it's only right that we try and attach an economic consequence to that. And so if businesses were to cover the costs of people using health services, they were to increase the tax they pay because they were employing foreign workers, I think we'd see an increase in revenue, but also see a fall in net migration.
Do you believe that Rishi Sunak is a tax cutter?
I think in his heart he is. I think he's been very prudent thus far. I think the time has come now, given the beneficial economic conditions and the fall in inflation and the growing economy, that we do need to be bold and we need to send the message. And I don't think we've quite done it yet, that we're on the side of the British taxpayer. We need to send the message that we're the party of low tax and that fundamentally people can keep more of what they earn.
And just briefly on other issues, you saw the speech on the steps of Downing Street last week from the Prime Minister. He said that extremism he fears is tearing us apart. What was your reaction to that?
Well, welcome words. I wouldn't disagree with his words, but I think the time for words has come to an end and we do need to see action. The next day we saw tens of thousands of people take to the streets, chanting hateful slogans and behaving in a totally unacceptable way in many instances, overwhelming the police, notably, where police resource has been disproportionate to actually what's happening. So we need to see a step change in the police response. They need to be enforcing the law. They need to be arresting people who are using threatening or abusive language. We need to be holding the police to account in a better way. And I would have liked to have seen an emergency law introduced to actually empower ministers and empower all of those policymakers who are responsible for this issue to actually take steps to restrict some of these marches. This has been going on now for 4 months. It's become a weekly fixture. Parts of London have become, no-go areas for Jewish people. That is totally unacceptable. We've seen anti-Semitism skyrocket. That cannot be the case in 21st century Britain, and therefore it's time for action, not words.
And was Lee Anderson wrong to say that Sadiq Khan is controlled by Islamists?
Listen, Lee Anderson is a great colleague of mine. I'm totally abhor the accusations that have been launched against him. He is not racist. He is not Islamophobic. He's calling out very poor performance by the Mayor of London, who has completely failed to hold the Met Commissioner to account, and which is why we've seen emboldened Islamism in the streets of London. We've seen an MP hounded out of office because of Islamism. We've seen Parliament totally subverted and the proper procedures abused out of fear from Islamism. We've seen anti-Semitism at record highs. I could go on.
Of course, but the remark is not Islamophobic, and there's no problem like that, of that nature in the party.
I don't think Lee Anderson is Islamophobic, not at all.
Okay, and just very quickly, today we're seeing that the small boats arrivals has passed through 40,000, 40,046 since Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister. Are you embarrassed by that record as a Tory?
Listen, I've spoken a lot about the boats in recent years. The priority is that we need to pass a law that actually stops the boats. I made my views clear that I don't think the law currently going through Parliament will do the job. I don't think it's going to be a sufficient deterrent. But the solution is actually ultimately to pass a law that excludes people from making individual claims, excludes the totality of international law, the European Convention of Human Rights, the Refugee Convention, which stymie our ability to control our borders, pass it via emergency measures, i.e. more quickly than is currently being done. So we get it on the statute books and we can actually operationalise flights to Rwanda on a large scale with large numbers of passengers and on a regular basis, because that's the only way we send the message that coming to the UK on a small boat will not lead to a life in this country.
It is very fine, Suella Braverman. You're 20 points behind the polls. That figure has been set in stone since the PM took over in Downing Street. Can he reverse that before the election?
Listen, the polls are very, very worrying. I just have to, in my constituency, we're facing local elections in 2 months' time, and people are very, very concerned. I worry very much for the prospects of our party, not just at the local elections, but also at the general election. But more than that, I worry about Labour taking the reins of power in this country. I think they would do untold damage to our economy. I think that they would be very weak, that Keir Starmer would be incredibly weak in terms of this rising threat from extremism. I don't think he will be able to control his party. And I think when it comes to standing up for Britain and standing up for British people, Labour will be a total and utter failure. And that's what worries me the most.
Suella Braverman, thank you.